I am so excited about today's guest and to introduce you to him. I think that everyone is going to find something that they come away with, whether it's the idea of getting to the root cause of issues with our body, listening to our body. But I kind of want to frame this a little bit in a personal sense for me. So when I was growing up, my father had severe headaches. It was a thing. We had to have the room dark. We had to be really quiet when he was going through one of these. And he actually wound up with kidney issues and kidney failure due to all of the over the counter medications that he was taking just to be able to do his workday, just to be able to get through the day. Well, when I questioned him when I was older, I asked him, when did the headaches start? And he said they started after the war. My father was a World War II vet. He went in on D-Day, saw a lot of combat, and he said once he got home from the war, these headaches started. They were so severe that even though he went into kidney failure, he was in the hospital. My mother snuck in his over-the-counter Excedrin for him to take, and he was taking an enormous amount of these. So I really want to dive into today the subject of headaches and listening to our body. I have with me Dr. Scott Vrzal, Dr. V. He had constant debilitating headaches in his youth, and he was initially misdiagnosed and advised to consult a psychiatrist due to the pains, basically being told it's in his head. So he embarked on a mission to understand the why. What was causing these headaches? It was a visit to a chiropractor that resolved his pain, brought healing, and ultimately changed his life. And then he brought that same type of excitement over finding the solution forward and pursued a career in the same discipline that was inspired by the change, being a holistic chiropractor. With over 30 years of experience, Dr. V recognizes and defines the pain patterns. We're going to talk about that. He advocates for drug-free and holistic solutions and shares his methods to a healthier lifestyle. His thriving practice reflects a personal commitment to health, performance, and relieving patients' pain. Welcome to the show, Dr. V.
Great build up, Carol. Thank you. I got
You're
to live up to all
welcome.
that.
Yeah, the pressure's
Yeah.
on, Dr. V. I want
All
to I want to
right.
obviously get into your story at some point because I think all of us in the health space, most of us, I'm going to say the majority, come with some type of story behind us, and often there was a pain point, whether mental or
Right.
physical, related to that story. But before we do, you talk about these patterns, these specific patterns that categorize the headaches, including migraines. Why is
hmm
it important to identify patterns? Isn't a headache a headache?
Perfect. Yeah. Great segue. Yeah. And my book is called The Headache Advantage because for me, clinically, the location of the head pain, the advantage of that is it tells me what the primary weakness is for that person and in their life. So there are I ultimately was whittled down to, or I whittled it down to 7 different locations, regions, if you will, in the head. And each of those regions has a different organ association. So if it's a left-sided headache, that's going to be a stomach weakness. They may have, a whole list of symptoms, but I know if they have head pain on the left, then stomach is going to be the biggest win or the biggest return on their health investment, if you will. So we do things to correct the stomach, and most of the other pain points or issues for them are going to resolve. And so that's really where we can take advantage of head pain. I mean, the type of work I do, every muscle has an associated gland or organ with it. And so, I mean, each of those has indicators. We'll talk about, the glute medius, for example, gets weak and tender when hormones are out of whack. And so, I would use that as an indicator. We need to work on hormones, and that would correlate with bitemporal or both-sided headache. That's a hormone headache. Each of those has indicators, but again, ultimately, the location of pain in the head really tells me what the priority is for that patient or where their primary weakness is.
Interesting. Now, how did you find these patterns? Was it something that as you went through your training, you were trained this way, or were you beginning to see certain patterns in patience and being able to kind of connect the dots.
Yeah, so and that's why the book needed to come out, because nobody else is doing this. A lot of the patterns I ultimately figured out through acupuncture meridians. The stomach meridian does kind of a ram horn around the left side, or bounces around the left side of the head and then goes down the neck and so on. So I looked at that, and as I was talking to patients and evaluating them, realized that, hey, if they had left-sided head pain, it was a stomach consideration. So ultimately, I just kind of gathered information from all over, being a seminar junkie and, research junkie, trying to figure these things out. Again, because I got into got into healthcare because of my own headaches, and being told that I was crazy. It was in my head because they couldn't see an aneurysm. I figured there had to be a better way. And so my mission, as soon as I got into practice, was to start using these tools in applied kinesiology, these muscle organ correlations and nutritional understanding, to and acupuncture understanding, to really identify what the triggers were for people. And so, after in the first few years, I had kind of the bulk of the headaches figured out. And then it just kept, confirming over and over again. I mean, my favorite line to really build confidence in the material, I mean, the reality is that headache never leaves my office. So that gives me that complete confidence that, yes, this is what's going on. These are the triggers, because of the fact that anybody that comes in with a headache, whether it's bitemporal or frontal or left or right, or what I call cyclops or back of the head, I do these approaches or we identify what the weakness is, correct that on the spot, and they leave without a headache. And how can you argue with whether or not that's a trigger, right?
And you've got to go through a lot of different questions and find out, because I imagine like some could be shoulder related. I recently, well, shouldn't say recently, about 6 months ago, before my back surgery, actually got a small tear in the rotator cuff. And over time, what do you think happened? That sensation was starting to go up into the trap, then the pain was going to the back of the head, and then I was having these odd headaches that kind of, radiated up. But I imagine you have to distinguish, okay, is it something to do with the muscle? Is it something to do with a tear? And then the microbiome, the gut. So how do you discover the connection? Because this is the first time I've heard someone talk about the connection
Right.
of the stomach with the headaches.
Mhm.
This is the first time. How do you discern that?
So it starts with some questions. Again, as soon as they say they have head pain in the head, or or vice versa. If they're talking about stomach issues, I say, do you have left-sided headaches? Or, if they're talking about digestive problems, that, I'm pondering, well, is it a gallbladder problem or is it a stomach problem? Say, do you have any headaches? And, well, it's not usually. When was the last time you had? Well, last week, And then they say it's a left-sided headache. I pointed to the right. If they say it's a left-sided headache, then I know stomach is the primary weakness. If they say it's a right-sided headache, then I know gallbladder is where we're going to work. And again, muscles have associated glands or organs, so that's the fun part clinically, and that's really the hard part in trying to put this together in the book. Is that in my mind, my job as a clinician is to take all those symptoms and find the common thread for all of them, and that's what gives us that complete clinical confidence or certainty, is when they have this whole list of symptoms, and then there's a very simple common denominator for all of them, of a certain food or a certain nutrient deficiency or a certain emotional conundrum that goes along with it. Then we address that, and it takes care of the lion's share of their problems. So that's the fun part clinically, but trying to put that in I put some flow charts in the book. And others, if they had a bitemporal headache, then there's 4 or 5 columns to go down and try to figure out which one fits in with what they're dealing with, and then it hopefully makes it a little more simple to identify, hey, tomatoes are the main cause of, or likely the cause of my problems, or I need vitamin B1 thiamine to help estrogen metabolism, those types of things.
So you talked about different areas of the body being associated with different things. So for instance, the gallbladder. And then before we hit record, we were talking about even L3, right around the L3 disc, and the association
Right.
to hormones. How How do hormones play into this? What is the role they have?
Right. Way to bring it back to your audience. Yeah. So when hormones are, and especially estrogen, is not metabolizing properly, the headache pattern for that is what I call bitemporal, or on both sides. And so that's, ladies, especially when hormones were more rampant, that's that, estrogen surge, mid-cycle and towards the end of the cycle, or I mean, towards right before menstruation. That's why those were kind of a monthly headache for a lot of gals. Physically, the glute medius, the muscle on the top of the glute area that supports the pelvis laterally as we lift one foot, that muscle needs to keep us straight without, flopping over to the side. That muscle will get weak and tender when especially estrogen metabolism or that ovary are not functioning properly. And so that's a physical sign. It could be a hip pain. Had a gal kind of similar to what you were talking about earlier, that had the hormone related IUD put in, and she was a runner seeking to get into the Olympics. And ultimately that IUD was creating a weakness of the glute medius muscle, and it was compromising her ability to ultimately perform and get to the marathon time that she needed to get into the Olympics. So that's a physical sign that I would look at. The other physical sign is like tennis elbow, or maybe today we call it pickleball elbow. So that's on the outside of the elbow. There's a tonification point for the hormones right on the outside of the elbow. And so that area is going to get weak and tender when estrogen is not metabolizing right. And incidentally, that often has to do with too much insulin causing estrogen dominance. And then that refers pain to the elbow. My experience there was I was on a road trip one time and kind of starting to get drowsy as I was driving. So pulled over to get gas and got some green tea. And by the second sip of the green tea, my elbow was just throbbing. And, it was like, oof, that hurts. What's going on? Looked at the green tea, the second ingredient was high fructose corn syrup. So shame on me not reading it before I bought it. But that was enough. Literally just those couple of sips of high fructose corn syrup was causing that throbbing, pulsing sensation in my outer elbow there. So that tells me that green tea, ultimately the high fructose corn syrup in there, was compromising my hormones. And so I did not drink it and just had to fight to stay awake.
So really with the hormones too, we're looking at really the gut health is part of this.
Yes.
And then what we're consuming could make a difference with the pain patterns. Am I understanding that correctly?
100%. So as a clinic, when we identify the area of weakness, or the primary area of weakness, and we look at whether it's a structural need, chiropractic and, physical therapy, things like that to strengthen or correct the areas. More often than not, there's a nutritional trigger, a food trigger. We'll talk about that in a sec. And then, maybe they need a nutrient or supplement, or like B1. Thiamine is a very common nutrient to help drive some of the liver pathways to break down estrogen, for example. So if somebody's on HRT or has on the pill or something like that, we're going to want to look at nutrients like thiamine or B6 to help break down that estrogen properly, so that we can reduce the potential consequences of that. And then the fourth thing we need to look at is emotional triggers. Every gland and organ has specific emotions with it. And so we might need to desensitize, if you will, to those emotional triggers. So circling back to what you brought up, yes, foods 100% are often the trigger. And that's always the best place to start. If we can, easy example of this is for this audience, especially when they're younger, corn is the most common thing I see to cause ovarian cysts. And very much disrupt ovarian function. It can cause low back pain. It causes cortisol to go up, basically exaggerates the stress response. But in doing that, it also compromises estrogen metabolism and will literally cause an ovarian cyst. Good example of this was a gal named Tiffany that was very clean on her diet, and it was doing well, understood. I used the blood type diet. I find a lot of good correlation there. So she was an O blood type female doing what she was supposed to. And in 2 days, she had an ovarian cyst grow and burst before she realized that the third ingredient on the rice chips that she was eating was corn. And that was enough to just that third ingredient on, a couple of chips that she was eating at night was enough to burst an ovarian cyst for her. So that's a good example of how sensitive, the body can be. And when we know, where to look, then we can identify those triggers. So yes, corn is a very common disruptor for hormones, stimulates cortisol production. Most corn in the U.S. is genetically modified, so the digestive system doesn't recognize it well. It's got glyphosate in it, the pesticide that inhibits bile production. So then when we don't produce bile, then we don't digest fats well. We have hormone cholesterol issues. I mean, the constellation goes on and on, really.
Corn, I know, can be inflammatory for the reasons that you mentioned, especially here in the U.S. Now, what if it's
Right.
organic, or you're traveling in Europe and you're having fresh corn?
Mhm.
Is there a difference, or can that be just as inflammatory?
Yeah. So on a blood type, from the blood type perspective, corn is very inflammatory, as well as peanuts are very inflammatory for the O blood type. Yes, in the U.S., corn almost. I mean, I treated one of the guys that was on the team that genetically modified corn back in the, I think it was 90s, to be able to use the pesticides. I mean, when we were kids, remember corn used to have
Oh, yeah.
worms in it when we peel it.
Hmm.
Not anymore, right? So, I mean, yeah, that's part of it. Yes, in Europe, they use far less glyphosate. So, I mean, wheat, for example, I mean, I was in Europe a couple times over the summer, and I was able to eat the breads there, or pizza, things like that. I don't typically splurge. I definitely don't splurge on that in the U.S., but I could get away with a little bit of it in the European Union. So it's a little better there, but I'm just not a fan of corn overall because of what it tends to do to most people.
No, that's interesting that connection is there, because I have always heard about the inflammatory response of corn, and specifically with the glyphosates and whatnot. Same
Mm-hmm.
with Europe. When I traveled over there, I ate things I would not eat
Right.
here
Mm-hmm.
because I know they would inflame me.
Mm-hmm.
Gluten specifically, if I eat it in the
Right.
US, boy, it's trouble. The joints swell. I have RA. It'll manifest in a
Mm-hmm.
not good way. So I can get that. Now you mentioned also the maybe the mental or the emotional aspect, and I'm assuming with my
Right.
dad's headaches, that would be an example of that.
Right. So PTSD is basically like a mental concussion, if you will. When we have the reason secondary concussions are more significant is because um, concussions cause a inhibition of the microglia, which is, think of the microglia as like the protective mechanism, the immune system of the brain, and that becomes diminished after a concussion. So with neurodegeneration that occurs with that, glutamate is actually the byproduct of that degeneration. So think of eating MSG, think of, eating soy sauce and MSG 24/7. That's kind of what goes on with either whether it's a PTSD mental concussion, if you will, or a physical concussion or multiple concussions, then we're in that chronic state of excitation. So when we're in that chronic excitation, a couple of things happen. One, the pathway in the liver called sulfation, where that excitatory, where the glutamate breaks down there, but cortisol breaks down there, serotonin breaks down there. When that pathway is not functioning well, that sets up a frontal headache, likely where he had his
Yes.
headaches.
Exactly.
Good guess, huh? so, with that, I mean, the current herb that's very popular that has shown some benefit with that is ashwagandha. That's an herb that's going to help blunt that overzealous cortisol response. So that's a fairly simple place to start. Ultimately, we want to look at things like milk thistle to get the liver functioning better, to help it break down those those byproducts of neurodegeneration. Then we want to look at calming, quenching the brain, that fire in the brain, if you will. And so that's omega-3s, that's your fish oils, and avocados if you're an A blood, blessed to be an A blood type in that case, or olive oil, things like that. There's also mushrooms right now. Lion's mane is very popular. Lithium, incidentally, think of lithium got popularized with bipolar. There's a medication that's a lithium carbonate for bipolar, which is kind of similar to PTSD, if you will. That lithium helps bring those microglia back, bring that protective mechanism back up. So that's something I've been using a lot of lately for people that have had long-term consequences of old concussions and things. Lithium will help rebuild that. So lion's mane, this product I have that my buddy created, actually, it's got lion's mane mushroom with lithium that has been showing to work really well post-concussion to quench the fire in the brain.
Now, is that a prescription that he developed
It's a
because of the lithium?
it's a supplement.
Supplement? It's a supplement. Okay,
Lithium. Yeah,
interesting.
lithium's a mineral, rare earth mineral that a lot of us need. So lithium carbonate was the medication. Lithium, forget aspartate or one of those, is what we're using as a mineral, as a supplement. It's very popular, and those that are aware as psychiatrists are using lithium as a supplement to calm a lot of like suicidal ideations, for example, things like that. It's a beautiful
Oh,
thing.
that's
I mean, I've had a couple of
interesting.
concussions with all my my activities, and I use similar products to quench some of the old challenges I've had from landing on my head a few times.
My goodness. So if you have somebody
Mhm.
with a concussion, how is that, and of course this is different than the PTSD, how is that
Mhm.
manifesting? Is that still that frontal type of headache, or how is that
So it
manifesting?
kind of depends. The most common cause or common symptom manifestation, one is think of PTSD as a mental concussion, if you will. So it's kind of similar the way it degenerates the brain, but it kind of depends on where they land. Most of the time, the concussions are on the parietal lobes, which have a lot to do with digestion. So had a gal flew in actually from New Mexico, chiropractor that flew in a couple of months ago, and she'd had problems for 20 years since she had two fairly significant auto accidents and concussions with those. She'd been everywhere, been to all the seminars and so on. Her main thing was this neurodegeneration that was taking place, that then causes an inhibition of digestive enzymes. So symptomatic is the chronic bloating challenge. In fact, just before I got on with you, I was responding to a patient that has a lot of this. It's most likely because of inflammation in her brain that is now compromising enzyme production, and so she can have bloating, sluggish digestion, challenges getting it right. Then the personal take enzymes get some benefit, but ultimately it's it's upstairs that the problem is.
That's so interesting. I was thinking about menopause as you were talking, of all things, because of that,
Right.
the estrogen and how it affects our brains. And
Right.
there's a book called XX Brain. Lisa
Mm.
Mosconi. I always pronounce her name wrong.
Okay.
But anyway, she looks into what happens to the female brain, when you have
Right.
estrogen, when that estrogen's depleted, and how important it is. How does that tie into what do you see with menopausal women as being a common type of headache or a common type of complaint that they have?
For sure. You ever had carb cravings during the cycle, right?
Oh, yeah,
I
for
mean, that's
sure.
right. I mean, estrogen affects mental outlook for sure. I mean, that's a great loaded subject. I mean, ultimately, too much estrogen inhibits thyroid production. So when the thyroid is down, thyroid hormone conversion ultimately. So if thyroid's not functioning well, then that's depression, crying, crying for no reason. That sluggish mentation, if you will. That's a sign of thyroid, underactive thyroid function. Estrogen is also acidifying, so it creates an environment that's more conducive to yeast overgrowth. I think that's a lot of what triggers the carb cravings for ladies with the estrogen surges, is because it acidifies, so then yeast proliferates or flourishes. Then that yeast wants to be fed, so it creates those carb sugar cravings. So that's a lot of where that comes from. So stabilizing estrogen. I like wild yam is a nice herb to help kind of smooth that out in those later hormonal transitioning years. Ultimately, what happens there is the ovaries start shutting down, and then the adrenals need to pick up the slack as the hormones transition. And so most gals are have are already adrenally fatigued, and so the adrenals there's not enough adrenal reserve left to pick up the slack, and so that's where a lot of the menopausal symptoms start coming from. So in that case, a lot of times it's about rebuilding using maybe a glandular, using chilling on corn, managing the stress better to help the adrenals function, have that adrenal reserve to smooth the transition. I mean, ultimately, menopause should be like, man, it's been a year since I menstruated, and
Hmm.
that's ultimately what it should be, right? But so many gals have that, that chronic stress cycle where they don't have the adrenal reserves to get through that transition smoothly, and it's a fiasco. So managing sugar metabolism, sugar, insulin causes estrogen dominance. That's going to affect it. Cortisol, to make those stress hormones, the body steals from, it's called progesterone steal, if you will. It steals from progesterone to make cortisol. So to preferentially get through the stress cycle, the girl hormones go down or get stolen from. So that's, again, adrenals is a big key factor, key player in that scenario.
Yeah, you brought up a good point with it stealing from progesterone and the effects of stress. I went down a rabbit hole just recently where, obviously stress is a big issue in perimenopause, leading into menopause and those hormonal shifts, but also with like micronutrient deficiencies, how stress can actually deplete the micronutrients. I had not realized until I really dove into this just recently, the extent of that, because we're always so focused on, are we getting our macros, protein, carbs, and fats, that's important, of course, but I think
Right.
the micronutrients get ignored.
Is there one of those you want to start with, or that's a huge
Dive in.
Right. So let's take two heavy hitters. Zinc was super, got a lot of press over the last few years with the whole COVID thing. Zinc gets depleted during times of stress. Viruses, as the immune system ramps up to fight a virus, that will cause deplete zinc. A bad zinc deficiency will manifest as white clouds in the fingernails. So if you're seeing white clouds in the fingernails, if food doesn't taste as good as it used to, zinc is very prolific in the sensation of taste and smell. So smokers, toxic metals inhibit zinc utilization in trying to drive the detoxification and competing for those toxic metals. So then when a person stops smoking, then all of a sudden food starts tasting better. And that's a lot of why people gain weight, after they quit smoking, because now food is enjoyable. And, before it kind of was just something they had to do. So zinc drives the immune system, drives hormone modulation. And it helps make stomach acid, and it also drives a pathway in the liver called P450, the first phase of detoxification. And so when we're zinc deficient, there's typically going to be signs and symptoms show up in all of those areas. So then again, clinically, we're like, zinc, this is it's hallmark zinc deficiency, easy thing to fix or take. Foods that are high in zinc, pumpkin seeds, try to find some organic if you can, pumpkin seeds, because the zinc gets into the food from the soil. So we need to have good, healthy, nourished soil to feed those organic vegetables to have the zinc in it. So pumpkin seeds are great for the O blood type, for the A blood type. Pumpkin seeds for the men are also very good for the prostate, that kind of stuff. So that's, and then as I mentioned, sugar leaches zinc and stress leaches zinc. So managing all that, most people need zinc. We're all surrounded with toxic metals and stress and that sort of stuff to deplete zinc. And so we would do well to take zinc. So that's one good kind of fun example of super common example of a micronutrient deficiency. Another one that comes up several times in the book because of the patterns it lays out is vitamin B1 or thiamine. Thiamine also helps us make stomach acid. And so if we're deficient in thiamine, there'll typically be stomach problems. Thiamine also helps, again, break down estrogen. So if we're not, if we're deficient in thiamine, then there'll be estrogen dominant type symptoms. Thiamine also helps drive the thyroid, or helps the thyroid make the thyroid hormones, the thyroxine. And so if we have symptoms in all three areas, incidentally, the reason it comes up in the book is because that would be a left-sided headache, because that's a stomach problem. That'd be a bitemporal headache because that's a hormone problem, and it'd be a suboccipital headache because that's a thyroid issue. So if somebody has all three types of headaches, I'm like, thiamine, let's get you a good source of vitamin B1, and you'll flourish. So that's how clinically we look at the common thread for all these areas. Often it can be a micronutrient. We always want to start with food if we can make a dietary change. That's our ideal, but it's a challenge to get healthy food and to eat properly in America.
It is a challenge, and I think it can almost be overwhelming because there's such an
Mm.
interconnectedness between all of the systems of the body. We can't separate them out, and I think that's been part of the problem with Western medicine is, you go to this doctor for, the gastroenterologist, and then you go over here for the hormones. And, you're kind of, I know sometimes I feel like I'm running to doctor over here if you have an autoimmune disease, but there's such, everything is connected. It's not simple. Where does someone start? Let's say they're having really
Mhm.
bad headaches. They don't know the source. How do they start to get to the bottom of this?
Well, now I'd have to say the
The book.
headacheadvantage.com. Yeah. I mean, really, again, that's why it had to be out, because I was baffled that nobody else is doing it that way. So yes, if headaches are a big part of what they're trying to figure out, that's a good place to start. The approach I talked about a lot about that looks at muscle organ correlations, that's called applied kinesiology. There's a website called ICAK USA, stands for International College of Applied Kinesiology. That is has a, select a doc, find a doc in your area. So that's a way to potentially find these applied kinesiologists near them. We didn't dive too terribly much into the mental emotional part, but if somebody like your dad, or somebody that had headaches ever since their divorce, or some significant emotional event, NET Mind Body, netmindbody.com is a website that keeps a lists of doctors that use the mental emotional approach, called applied kinesiology, called NET, neuro emotional technique. That's where I got a lot of my insights on how organs are associated with the different emotions. There's also a tapping approach that's more of a designed to be something that a person can do for themselves during times of stress, or to help desensitize to emotional triggers. So there's approaches like that. If you know that it has happened again ever since a significant event, then I would start with the mental emotional thing. Those are a couple resources to get people going in the right direction.
Absolutely, that's so helpful. Migraines is a common one that I hear
Mm.
from women, and my daughter suffers from migraine headaches, and it started in her teens, and then she had
Mm-hmm.
ovarian cysts. So what do they do? The birth control pill or the shot at that time
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to try to get it under control. I've had clients who are put on the IUD that has the progesterone to try to get this under control.
Mm-hmm.
What is there one cause to migraines, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Migraines, for the most part, means very significant headache or debilitating. Again, it comes back down to where the headache is located. So if your daughter's headache started, teens, presumably as hormones were brewing and changing and that sort of stuff, is it a bitemporal? Do we know where her headaches were located for your daughter?
I'm going to ask her because she just describes, the whole feeling of the aura coming on, having to, darken the room. She has medication she
Mm-hmm.
takes if it's really bad where she can't
Mm-hmm.
drive. But I'm going to ask
Wow.
her where they're originating from.
Yeah. So if there's an aura, there's a pretty significant adrenal component. The adrenals need to tonify the pupil to block out light when we, get into bright lights. And so when we're stressed, that's why we want sunglasses so bad, that kind of thing. That's kind of similar in a minor sense of what goes on with the aura. So again, it's kind of like we were talking about earlier, where the adrenals are stealing from hormones. So most likely she would do well on the herbs to help facilitate or heal the adrenals, help them function better. Often either a glandular or B1. Again, if she also has the bitemporal headaches, then thiamine, a good source of thiamine, could be very fruitful, very beneficial in her case. So to circle back again, migraines, it comes back to location. Location, location, location. That was my original title for the book, right?
That's great. I love it.
So so she says migraines, where does it hurt? And look at, in the book, there's flow charts. There's things like that to get that information. So migraine, just again, look at where it hurts, and that will lead us down the road. There's something else in there. You talked about the progesterone. So for this audience, wild yam is my favorite herb. I don't think we talked about that yet. So if a gal's struggling through those midlife hormonal transition years, of course, midlife keeps getting older, and I mean, I think midlife is
I
80
know.
for me now, because But if they're
That's
struggling with
funny.
those hormonal years, it's got to be somewhere out there, right? So that we keep feeling young. But wild yam helps to kind of resensitize to the hormones and so on. So that's one of the most common herbs I'm testing for gals that are struggling through those hormonally transitioning years.
Yeah, those are some rocky years. They were for me. I look back on that, and it's almost easier when you are on the other side of menopause. It's almost
Mm-hmm.
easier to deal with things than when you've got these fluctuations that are so wild. Now, you've given
Mm-hmm.
some excellent examples of success stories with your clients. Have you had a client or a patient, I should say, where it has been a challenge for you to figure out the source, where we really had to dig in to figure out, okay, what is the source? What's causing these headaches? And what do we do?
Great question, and that's what drives me. I don't like to get stumped. I work hard to be able to have the tools, and that's really, I mean, in Chiro school, um, I went into it because with the heart to serve, to be able to figure out whatever comes in. So I took a position in a club that was bringing all the kind of the thought leaders from the various techniques in, with the intent of figuring out who had the most answers ultimately. And that's why I dove into applied kinesiology, because they had the tools to figure out whatever walked in. If somebody came in with supercalifragilistic disease, and I had no idea what it was, I had the tools to whittle it down to the least common denominator of what was triggering it. So, and after now doing this for literally tens of thousands of patients and over 30 years, it's pretty hard to stump me. I don't want to sound pompous or any of that, but I mean, that's because I've done it so much and worked through it with so many people. Yes, once in a while, a headache will come in, and it takes a bit of investigation to identify. We get them feeling much better, and then they still end up with one in the month between that we saw them, and then we have to figure out what they ate or were exposed to. um, but yeah, I mean, even autoimmune, I teach a 12-hour autoimmune condition. I mean, that's a whole nother subject, but I mean, a lot of your listeners are probably have some manifestation of long hauler type stuff. The challenge with COVID is that it's going to basically further exaggerate whatever primary weakness was there already. So if a gal had thyroid problems and then contracted COVID or got the vax, it's going to exaggerate that autoimmune attack against their thyroid or against their ovaries or against their heart or adrenals. And so then, if you're dealing, or gentlemen and listeners, if they're dealing with, these long hauler type, quote, long hauler challenges, look at supplements to rebuild the gland or organ that took the primary attack. So, I mean, I bring that up because autoimmune is kind of that. There's no autoimmunologist, but autoimmune is a big class that is often misunderstood out there. When you understand the mechanisms like that, it's a pretty treatable thing.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier rheumatoid arthritis, RA, that
Mm-hmm.
I've got my diet a certain way, my lifestyle a certain way, where I've been able to control symptoms, but I still do have flare-ups. So a lot of the listeners and a lot of the clients I've worked with have been diagnosed with some type of autoimmune, whether it's
Right.
Hashimoto's, lupus, RA. And
Mm-hmm.
what is the when you have a patient with that, is that going to be the first place that you start with, is with the autoimmune disease, with some type of protocol for that?
Most likely, yes. So RA at its root is a leaky gut problem. So a lot of the autoimmune problems start because the gut intestinal lining is compromised, and toxins are getting through the intestinal. It's a single cell layer between that potentially toxic gut and the bloodstream. And so if we get toxins that are leaking through that gut barrier into the bloodstream, it trips up and triggers inflammation and so on. So, if they have multiple autoimmune conditions, then we for sure want to get the gut lining healed. Incidentally, minerals are one of the best glue, if you will, or tonifiers for that gut lining. So keeping our mineral status up is going to help prevent those autoimmune things. Alcohol, unfortunately, exaggerates leaky gut. So we want to tonify that intestinal lining to reduce that overall inflammation. But for sure, it's an intestinal issue that is going to cause arthritic aches and pains. Glyphosate, the pesticide in Roundup, is a massive trigger for that. So we want to look at what foods are sometimes it's nightshades. Sometimes it's just that chronic stress that kind of deteriorates, if you will, the intestinal lining and sets up that autoimmune thing. So we want to look at enzymes. We want to look at minerals to rebuild the intestinal lining. You also mentioned Hashimoto's. Similarly, when we have that leaky gut, the molecular mimicry, they call it, for Hashimoto's, the wheat protein, the amino acid structure of wheat is identical to the thyroid. So if a person's under stress and they get that leaky gut paradigm, then they eat wheat, that can launch an autoimmune attack against the thyroid. So if they have Hashimoto's, they had known things. One, we might want to look at a supplement, what's called protomorphogens, to rebuild the thyroid. Wheat is a very common trigger for Hashimoto's. You also mentioned lupus. That's more of an autoimmune attack against the adrenals. So similarly, we're going to want to look at what the key stressors are, take a Sabbath day, chill out, that sort of stuff. But then take a supplement to rebuild the adrenals. Typically, that's going to be, again, a protomorphogen for the adrenals, or some sort of a glandular to rebuild the adrenals for the lupus. It manifests as the malar rash and low energy and all that stuff.
I really like that you're bringing in the gut health into this so much, because I do think so many problems begin there. When you said that about RA, that's really the first time I noticed something was wrong. It began with stomach issues,
Mm-hmm.
and then joint
Mm-hmm.
issues and fatigue issues, and kind of just snowballed there. And at the
Mm-hmm.
time, I didn't know what I know now. So I was really just oblivious to what was happening in my body.
Mm-hmm.
And then I love
Mm-hmm.
that you are distinguishing between the autoimmune diseases, because I think sometimes they get all lumped together. And it's like,
Right.
okay, one cause, one way to treat, one diet. And it's not as simple as that, because there's different mechanisms going on in the body.
Right. And kudos to you. I mean, look at how many people have been blessed by the challenge that you had, right? You had, RA, you've had the back issues, and the challenges that you had got you to double down and figure out what was going on. And here you are doing this, blessing thousands, with the information that God has given you through this season, or these seasons in your life. So good on you for making a difference through your trials. I'm here for my headaches were the whole headache. Just to circle back, we haven't really covered the intestinal type of a headache, but that's a headband. That's pain all the way around the head.
So
And
going all the way around this way,
feels like it feels like a
tight cap or
headband.
something. Yeah.
Right. It might have a pulsation or a throb to it as well, but in general, it's that when they go like this, or they have trouble describing the location or the pattern, that's typically going to be a sign of an intestinal problem. Physical manifestations of gut biome being out of whack or not functioning right. Thumb pain, large intestine 4 is a super common acupuncture point on the thumb. So the thumb's going to get tender. Arthritis is a colon issue. The IT band, if you're dealing with athletes, right? The IT band is going to get weak and tender when the colon's not functioning right. The quadratus lumborum muscle is that key low back stabilizing muscle. Those muscles are going to get weak and tender when the colon's not functioning right. So those are all like physical manifestations that a person might have. That's their body saying colon problems. So figure out what the food trigger is.
So that was the type of headache you had that went all the way around? Was the type you were suffering from? So we haven't talked about that. How long did you suffer with those headaches, and then how did that chiropractor help you?
Right. So I did what I knew. I tried aspirin, Advil, Tylenol, did all the over-the-counter stuff, and it wouldn't touch it. So I'm like, forget it. I'm just going to keep working out. I can't not work out, and so I'd try to push through it. And the harder I'd push through it, the longer the headaches would last. They ultimately came on when I was bench pressing, is where it all started, pushing the neck against the table and the bench and so on. And they would just pound and last. And like I said, nothing would touch them. And if I try to force through it for the following 2 days after trying to do bench press, just going upstairs in my house would exaggerate the headache, and it'd pulse and pound more. So then so I dealt with that for almost 2 years, for about a year, by the time I finally got the CAT scan, and they said, you know, I was crazy. You know, they'd backed down a little bit because I hadn't worked out for 2 weeks because of the threat of an aneurysm and so on. So then they came on with the vengeance almost about 6 months to a year later. The guy in the gym's like, hey, I'm a chiropractic intern. Don't know. Let's see what we can do. And I mean, at that point, he gave me an adjustment that I now know was at C2, the second cervical in the neck, is related to colon function. So he gave me a great adjustment there. I was like, poof, the whole world changed. You know, I'm driving home my little yellow bug, like, man, life is good. I want this for everybody. I want to feel this way forever. Incidentally, as I looked into chiropractic, I had quit eating sugar at 14 because of the hypoglycemic issues I was having, getting into trouble in school and eating donuts before and after school, and doing dumb kid stuff. I was diagnosed hypoglycemic. It's like, oh, sugar is the reason I'm behaving this way, and the reason I'd perform very hard, very good at the time, racquetball for 15 minutes, and then I could care less, and I wouldn't do anything. Once my mom says, well, what'd you eat? I'm like, a donut. That's what I always eat. And so, I realized that correlation by that point I was a natural bodybuilder. So, looking at all the, the muscles and how to, make each one grow properly and that sort of stuff. Then with the nutrition stuff, chiropractic was like, yeah, this has my structural interests and has my nutritional interests. It was a slam dunk.
It would be so easy if it were just one thing when we're looking at pain or health issues.
Mm-hmm.
I know from coaching women, and I've gotten really fond of saying this, it's not one thing. It's a lot of things,
Mm-hmm.
all of the things. And I've been
Mm-hmm.
thinking as we move through this podcast, stress, a big one.
Right.
The microbiome, what we're eating, what we're consuming, if we're sugar
Right.
fiends and we're eating sugar all the time, which was me in my 40s. I ate a lot
Mm-hmm.
of sugar and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of starchy, refined carbohydrates, those type of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two things are really standing out to me, aside from physical, like, like I said, a torn rotator cuff or whatever. Those are the two things standing out to me. Is there anything I'm missing?
Yeah, muscles tear because of the neurologic, we call it conditional weakness, that goes along. When you were pointing to your left shoulder, the levator scap muscle has to do with calcium regulation. So it's a gland called the parathyroid that keeps calcium in the bones. So we want to make sure that that's working properly. Again, that relates back to that sulfation pathway in the liver, opening up another can of worms. But Lyme is a group of pathogens that their common thread for all the Lyme pathogens is that they inhibit that sulfation pathway. That is a very common manifestation in that levator scap muscle that would be attaches from the top of the shoulder blade all the way up the neck. And then each rotator cuff muscle has associated glands or organs with it as well. The supraspinatus muscle that initiates, the raising of the arm, that muscle gets weak when brain chemistry is out of whack. So typically means neurotransmitters out of balance, whether that's dopamine or noradrenaline or things like that. So we want to address those, and then that muscle will fire properly. So hopefully, if it wasn't a complete tear, then we address the initiating weakness, and the muscle can recover. Shoulder, frozen shoulder or shoulder weaknesses and problems can get better as well.
Okay, so we've got the digestive piece, the stress piece, the organs. If an organ is not functioning correctly or it's stressed, the liver, I would imagine, plays such a huge role. Toxins, detoxification. So quite a few things to look at here. And what an example your own of suffering with these headaches and discovering, I mean, first of all, with the sugar, discovering that young that you needed to get rid of sugar.
Right.
It took me into my 50s to do that. So I think that's just amazing. I'm always fascinated when somebody has had these realizations so young and gone forward to make a career out of it. Is there, as we begin to kind of wrap up here, is there, Dr. V, anything that we didn't touch on that you think, what, the listener really needs to know this? And then second of all, how can they get your book, follow you, learn more about your work?
Thank you. there's so much, it's an endless. So, I mean, like I said, I teach 12 hours on thyroid, I teach 12 hours on autoimmune. So subjects we didn't touch yet. Really, the take home is listen to your bodies. I mean, the body tells a story. Unfortunately, most of what so-called healthcare is trying to mask what the body's trying to tell people. So do your due diligence. We have to be our own advocate as consumers, as people pursuing vitality. So if it hurts when you do a certain motion, maybe it's doing a food journal, doing a log to figure out, hey, every time I eat ice cream or eat birthday cake with the family to celebrate, then I have a rough night's sleep. The triggers are there, the answers are there. It may take a little bit of research. So if it comes down to logging what you're eating, and then log what you eat, and then in the margin put when your symptoms flare, that might give you a convenient way, a cheap, easy, free way to figure those things out. But keep pushing, keep searching. Unfortunately, doctors don't always have the answers. We have to be our own advocate to figure that out. So I would just encourage and empower. That's a lot of, again, what I tried to set up in the book is to help people have the tools to understand this is what my body's trying to tell me, and then that'll get them to the least common denominator. So listen to your bodies. They're telling a story. That would be my biggest call to action. The book, headacheadvantage.com is where the book is, and it's on Amazon. Electronic and soft cover and hardcover are on Amazon, available for purchase. My clinic website is drvrzal.com, drvrzal.com. We've got four doctors there doing the applied kinesiology, so happy to help you that way. And then I try to post little health pearls on social media. If you can spell my last name, Vrzal, you should be able to find podcasts like this, and YouTube and Instagram and all that sort of stuff to keep you inspired, hopefully.
I love the piece of advice on the journal, because that was actually a question that was kind of mulling around in my mind, and then I got distracted. But I think that is so key, because I used to use the testing for food sensitivity, and then I found out like people were testing sensitive to everything, like
Right.
I don't know, a cracker, a piece of celery.
Right.
And I realized, okay, from talking with different doctors, if somebody has a leaky gut, if they have that permeability, they're going to have this inflammatory response to just about everything. But I think the food log is so good, because that's really getting into your body. That's really looking at what you're eating and being in touch with how you're feeling, and going, you know what? Because I just had a client recently do this with dairy, which is like, nope. She gets this rash, and when she stops the dairy, it goes away. And just those kind of realizations, so powerful. So I'm really happy that you pointed that out. I will make sure that all of your information is in the show notes. I encourage the
Thank you.
listeners, get the book, follow Dr. V, follow his work. I mean, we could have just gone into so many different directions here, but this has been incredibly valuable. Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
V.
Thank you for all you're
And
doing, Carol.
oh, you're
Appreciate you
welcome.
going forth and changing lives, helping people have a better life.
It's all of us. We all have something to contribute, like a little bit different. And that's why I love to have experts on, because they know things, like you knew things I do not know. So together, just being able to have this information, I think is so, so important. And to our listeners, wherever you are in the world, we wish you every blessing. Bye for now.